Hi everyone, welcome another week at Mutant Watch. And today we have with us Sandy Jimenez, which is right here, and he's a writer, artist, director, and well, as you will see around we go with the show today, he has a special relationship with X-Men stuff, and that's part of why we want to talk with him. And also, we today we are Gabriel right here, and and I'm Duna. And before we start, we want to dedicate this show to Richard Corbin, who just passed away 2 days ago, and who we're gonna talk about the small work he did for X-Men stuff, but the work he did was a big influence in a lot of artists
Yeah.
that took part in that. A lot of basically, we wouldn't have a sci-fi and terror comics without him. So that's something that we wanna like dedicate the show. And also, before we start, I also want to remind everyone of the Black Lives Matter protest, especially because also I think it was 1 day ago a protester was killed, Chris Smith, and I wanna remind everyone that in blacklivesmatter.card.co you can sign petitions, you can stay alert because a lot of info about trying to make this process for his family and for other protesters and keeping people safe and donating to various places will be up there. So I want to remind everyone to check that information because it's goddamn important. And if both of you, any of you want to add anything before we start?
You got it all covered, Duna.
I think so. That's wonderful that you mentioned Richard and uh, you know Black Lives Matter. Of course, is something that's very much a day-to-day developing thing here in the United States. So
Okay, so let's roll it.
This week on Mutant Watch.
Okay, so here we are. And well, the theme of this show, and we're gonna go through various runs on different comics on this and eras, is social commentary on the X-Men, which I think it's very poignant to do. It's a thing that I feel comics um, should be doing, and that's my first question for both of you and for thinking myself too, is uh, how do you feel like X-Men comics has a social commentary implemented into it? Like how it's easier to do that than on other comics, maybe, or how? Yeah, that would be it for beginning.
yeah, I mean, it's one of the most potent allegories I think in superhero comics. In some ways, it sort of formed a template for other people in other titles and in other work to do the same thing. I mean, it has allegories for sort of racism and things sort of built in, but also just the actual way sort of civil unrest and civil disobedience and the civil rights movement played out here in the United States is very much through the lens of the struggle of African Americans, very implicit in the template of X-Men because as many people have said apocryphally, like Magneto is sort of like the Malcolm X response to oppression, and Professor X is the sort of assimilation, sort of peaceful response as embodied by somebody like Dr. King. So I mean, all of that is loaded in there just in the beginning from when the comic is done. It's no coincidence that it was done in the '60s, and it's a comic book about young people. So I mean, it starts off as a very sort of limited allegory, but it explodes as we've seen as readers for decades.
I think that like you said, it's very inherent in the X-Men. One of the biggest premise of being a mutant is being other, being someone different, being someone discriminated against, and it's something that resonates in people of color. It's something that resonates in queer people, and I think that it's already kind of served up on a platter for them to go with those comparisons because of the very nature of what a mutant is.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Gabriel, because the interesting thing, or the conundrum I think that all of us live with as citizens of the world today in the 21st century, and have really for the last 2 centuries, is the concept of skin-based race color is entirely fictive. It's not biologically real. But racism is. The racism it inspires is a concrete thing. What's happening in X-Men is actually something quite radical, which is they're telling you these people are different. These people are sort of a different race. And they're also telling you at the same time, if that were true, it doesn't matter. You still have to afford people decency. You still cannot oppress them. You cannot exploit them. You cannot treat them as non-human, even if indeed they were non-human. So it undercuts the argument in this very radical way that addresses the fictive nature of race and says it's still illegitimate. Even if you accept its premise, it's still illegitimate. Even if you accept the premise that made slavery possible, it's still illegitimate. And that's such a, for writers like Claremont to do that was such a really radical thing in the 70s, to really keep underscoring that.
So you just made an awesome point, because I my view was also that the thing that they were fear of and hatred by humanity could apply to a lot of collectives, but I feel like in the first books, in the Stanley first books, in the first run, it was not like very like we're gonna do a political allegory explicitly here. It was not very like a strong part of the comic. But then Chris Claremont arrived, and he pretty much all he did was explicit political allegories all the time. And I think that's also because like Chris Claremont was had a degree in politics. So the thing that he was doing before writing comics was trying to work on doing social political theory for a living, which is not something that that really gets you a living usually most times. So he turned into comics. That's part of the story, and I feel like that's a big part of why uh, is so strong in that. Yes, they making the X-Men like different genetically, which is not something that really applies to any oppression in real life, but they're saying like you say, like even if they're different genetically, that it still shouldn't make them prone to oppression. And I think with that we roll with my next question, my next point, which was how you both feel like the Chris Claremont, Louis Simonson, and Nocenti, that era of the X-Men, rolled this political thing farther than it was before. Because it's part of why I think I love it is that era, and how it expresses things that have happened to people in real life in different codes. And that's my question. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's there's clearly times, when there were story arcs that were clearly responding to the politics of the time or the political challenges of the time. I think it's not, a small thing to point out that Chris Claremont was, a young person in the 1960s, and and Nocenti and Louis Simonson. These are people who are product of, if not directly the counterculture movements, people who lived through them and lived through the upheaval of that time period, and saw, what solutions were possible and what solutions didn't go as far, and what sort of movements failed. And, their work, continued those sort of ethics and at least the observations and responses to them over the decades, whether it was with regards to apartheid or with regards to, the sort of inherent separation in various societies. X-Men, it's interesting that it's a school of kids that keeps matriculating in new generations. Just that very sort of aspect of it made it feel very current, and in the hands of Louis Simonson and Ann Senti, certainly, like, that became so central, I think, as a young reader, to being able to relate to it and being able to directly transpose it, not as this far away metaphor, but something that was really speaking to what was happening as you were reading it.
I really don't have anything to add to what he said. I think it was also a lot more, even though there was storylines where it was very explicit. It was also very much in the tone of it. Like in New Mutants, just how the kids are reacting to being that ostracized, being that other. Then there's also the explicit storylines, like with Larry Bovine, where his whole story is pretty much him not being able to handle being outed. Where the analogy is so blatantly on the page, to elicit that empathy. I think they really pushed that further during that era.
Yeah, I mean, their story arcs, when they get into particulars, if you look at something like, I mean, the country's called Genosha, and then the story ends up being about a genocide, just the alliteration of those terms, and the fact that they put a time, place, albeit a fictive place, right, that's off the coast of, I think it's like north of Madagascar or something, this mythical place, but that they assigned a series of numbers to the genocide. I think it's like something like the population was like 17.5 million mutants, and then they're reduced by 16.5 million, leaving a million in their place. That's one of the most important things as we sort of look at genocide as a recurring problem across all of our civilizations. We tend to think, especially here in the United States, look at it a very singular thing through the lens of the Holocaust. It's in fact a thing that we've done as humans several times over and over again, and have done as recently as the troubles in Africa in the 90s. This is something that people do. They isolate a group of people and say, we're people and you're not, and we're going to wipe you out. And that the X-Men took such a literal sub-history approach to their own cosmology and gave it numbers, gave it a time, gave it a specific series of aims where you can understand why it's happening. Some of it's economic. There's a whole sort of slavery aspect to it. There's, of course, this equity of power that becomes very valuable. So they try to monetize it and they try to oppress these people. And if they can't, they're going to kill them. And that's, I mean, what is more potent an allegory than that? They couldn't have underlined it for readers more, but it's a very important way to look at genocide, from a data perspective, from as well as the spiritual horror of it, but to actually look at the mechanics of it. And they put that in this fictional world context. And I thought it was a very responsible thing to do, to get people thinking that way, because especially when you start looking at dynamics like Holocaust deniers, one of the first things they do is attack the numbers. One of the first things people who are invested in continuing any kind of oppression, one of the first things they do is to deny that it's happening. That's what makes it a complete crime. The Holocaust of World War II is all the more poignant because we have such good data, because the Nazis kept such excellent records. We know exactly what they did. We know the experiments they performed on people. And for them to take that sort of very factual approach, generally when you see sort of massacres and things of that nature, world events presented in comic books, it's always painted with a very broad sort of fictional brush. Probably because it's too much, I think, or they think it's too much for a reader to handle. But the fact that they just got into actual numbers and said, this is it, 16.5 million people killed, I remember just reading those stories and just being staggered by just how insane those numbers were. And yet If you buy the premise of the original series that there were mutants among us and it was, whatever the ratio was, it doesn't seem that crazy, and it seems all the more sort of real and tangible. Yeah,
So
sorry, that's a bit of a, bit of a, bit of a downer,
no,
but I
no,
think
it's
it's
okay.
really one of the most energizing things
No,
about that Genosha storyline, and really what they did afterwards, the Grant Morrison stuff as well, just really putting things in a real world context.
mm, and I think I have reread for this so the whole Genosa arc, and I don't know how it felt at the moment, but reading it, it was pretty obvious that Chris Claremont was trying to talk about apartheid. I don't know if that's the impression that it did at the moment, if everybody look at that book and say it is about apartheid or not. But
The fact that it's located so close to Africa, I mean, and the mechanisms in it, I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, he was speaking to just how dynamic oppression is, at a time when it was being presented as something unrelatable. I think people in different countries were able to see the sort of mechanisms of apartheid at work in their own countries as well, which is, I thought, was important about it.
and also without getting to like, I get it's difficult to do a comic about a time like that, like to try to roll it and get it to a place where it's useful. If that's what something like that would be useful for, point it out to other people how this is, hurtful. And well, reading it, there were some points that for me were kind of missing or lacking. Uh, I don't want to get too super critical of it, but I did think there were a couple of things that really seemed weird. One that was that in the Genosar, there was mutants that were working for the government and like working for their own extinction, and also that. While it was horrid and that is true and great, I feel like it was also distanced, mostly probably because of the fact that this was an academic writing a book about something that he was not exactly living. And I don't know if you all have any insight into that.
The whole thing about the sort of mutants that are complicit in their own destruction, I thought again was very potent allegory. It
Mhm.
all comes down to me that the recurring drumbeat in all X-Men comics is, who are we talking about when we say people, right? Because human is a sort of relative term in this context. There are people who are just so unrecognizably not sort of proto-simian like us. This whole notion of what a monster is, something that's out of the natural order. Well, if you're getting sort of beyond that, it's like these people who are sort of on the side of the government and sort of working with Gyrick and people like that, and all of that sort of those storylines. These are people who clearly saw themselves as people along with these sort of non-powered human beings, and had made that distinction in their minds. And I think that that is something that happens, when the oppression comes down, in any time period in history, whenever we see fascism takes hold, the real horror of fascism is that it's not absolute oppression. It does need buy-in from the people. At a certain point, people have to accept the rule of a fascist dictator, because you can't, the numbers just aren't there, right? So if you look at, 1933 in Germany, certainly, it was a bully sort of pushing his way through and dismantling the political process. But at a certain point, the average person had to say, we're okay with this guy being in charge. And that's what's happening in those stories, that kind of soft oppression where people are sort of convinced that this is part of a greater good, and you can sort of separate that part of your identity from this other person We see it in the way that certain populist movements are sort of you know made to throw in with people who have no interests in common with them, right? Like you have these grassroots movements that sort of ally themselves with the 1%. These sort of like so-called grassroots conservative movements, and it just doesn't even make any sense. But that's the same kind of thinking, really, when you get down to it. Someone who thinks they have more in common, let's say, again, not to get overtly political on this talk, which I think we want to avoid, but someone seeing themselves as having much more in common with, Trump, and not like their fellow worker. Something much more in common with someone who's got millions of dollars, and not the person who shares their economic plight. So it's a recurring theme, I think, that has a lot of application to a lot of things.
Yeah. It's very much a psychological construct of us versus them. And by aligning us as being these people who are winning, whether it's the rich in the real world or the humans in Marvel Comics, we end up investing in this us concept. If anyone in the us group is winning, then I am winning. And the best way for us to win is to make sure the other person loses. And that's where that discrimination comes in, is by lowering someone else or some other group, I am in fact raising my group. And the fact that logic doesn't really hold water in actual practicality, the mentality of it is that I'm part of the better group. And it hits and it creates these dynamics that, like you were talking about.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it's we always wonder, like, why doesn't racism go away? Like, why don't these problems go away? And one of the things that the X-Men comics, in these storylines that Duna brought up, explain and sort of illustrate very well, is because there's something in it for somebody. There's something, it's commodified. There's an investment in saying we're the people and you're not. We're the people and you're a problem, and we're going to solve you. And that's a sort of recurring, theme in those comics to this day. Certainly, it's certainly been handled, I think, very overtly in the brand extensions they did in the movies in the early 2000s. I think the second and third picture sort of hit it pretty heavily.
And kind of going back to, I think what you were saying, Duna, is that when Claremont did it, there was kind of this distance, since it was kind of an academic process to it. And I think that is something that can be noticed in the comics, particularly when it's written by someone who is not part of a marginalized group, due to it being that difference, being, it's not their lived experience. I think that can be noticed, and I think it can be noticed in the readers as well. Like what you were saying is how people can wonder why racism has not gone. I've seen a lot of people talking about X-Men today and with the MCU, and how they feel it wouldn't work, because why would there be this hatred towards the X-Men when there's not hatred towards the powered Avengers, etc. I think there is that distance that people aren't recognizing, the fact that it does happen, and it doesn't need to make sense for it to continue to happen.
Exactly.
We have an special guest that was last moment is Rain from Curfew Blair in Twitter, and he was just telling me that he wanted to join. So so I was like, yes.
Good job. Well, thanks
We're all like that.
Thank you. I appreciate you for letting me come on. It's been great so far. I've been on the edge of my seat, so please.
So I lost my track of what we were talking, but if you wanna put your input, Rain, on the whole, we're talking about the Genoso stuff, and also like into what we were talking about, people looking at things maybe through some glasses that are aside from me, academic. Gary was talking about this very well just at the moment.
I was pretty much in agreement. I think the Genosha thing, like I said, for me was that however fictional, of course, comics are political. Comics do pull, just like TV shows, art you pull from real life things. But I think to see um, such an event handled in a book that's supposedly for kids, I really gave it a different, not a different framework. It allowed you to look at something that is a real. It's like teaching. It's teaching you something because if you care about Jean Grey and what's happening to her, you might not care about a real woman named Jean Grey in the real life. But when you see these things happen in a book that's for kids and is handling these real world issues, it makes you, even if you don't care a bit more, I think it puts it a little bit further on your radar. I think that's why you get so many people who get maybe offended at the SJW of it all or the diversity of it all. But I think Genosha was a really interesting um, kind of concept where you didn't have to say this is a certain type of person. Like these are mutants. You're putting everything on mutants. So it makes it easier, I think, to tell a story, even if you aren't or maybe don't feel like you're as qualified, because you're still getting those same beats across. This is a horrible event that happened to a large number of people, and you can look at any history book and see that same um, blueprint, that same on paper. This is a horrible event that happened to a large number of people because of this, that, and the third. So that's what I liked about it. Yeah, I'm just yeah, that's right.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, there's a certain pattern that I think they were able to illustrate that was a really potent lens, I think, for young people who may not even have reached that point in their course of study in school, for them to see it so that when they do sort of learn about this stuff in actual history, they recognize this pattern. I think there's a real danger when we look at certain catastrophic events in human history, be they wars, be they various types of oppression, as singular, unique things.
Mhm.
It's not to say that they're not horrifying, but we should point out that they're not singular,
Mhm.
because once we do, we sort of let our guard down and they happen again because of that. It's not so much that people, I think, are ignorant of history at times and therefore repeat it. It's that they're ignorant of the fact that history does repeat,
Mhm.
which is a much simpler idea, but a harder one to get across, I think.
Yeah.
And also pointing out on what Gabriel said just a moment ago, because I just got it back on my thought process. And yeah, a lot of people are like very wary of the mutants entering the MCU and getting into the big movies right now. And I think a big reason is people are like, there's this tendency of trying not to look at bigotry when we want our media to not have bigotry on it.
Mhm.
And I feel like that, like a book like the first Len Wayne Claremont, the first Uncanny X-Men book, uh, even today would be pointed out as SSGW, as a book that is trying to force diversity just because it's cats and the themes it treats this. And I feel like that's a big part of like um, trying to not look at these things directly on books, that I feel like I don't know, like just to ask you all, what do you think about how these things should be looked at directly in movies, in books, in things that come, and how X-Men specifically helps with that. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, I think I know what you're trying to sort of grasp at. I mean, the X-Men, of course, have a very interesting legacy insofar as their first iteration in the 1960s, however much it was, either an overt or subvert allegory for the civil rights movement and the civil rights struggle in our country, the characters were all white.
Mhm.
And suddenly, like almost like in a snap of the fingers, they become this very, not just sort of multi-ethnic but multi-nationality group.
Mhm.
They have a Russian character, which,
Mhm.
here in America, that's a big deal, and sort of not a big deal, right? Because they're not, sort of a visually ethnic minority. But I will tell you, having grown up with kids who were the children of Russian immigrants or Russian immigrants themselves, they sort of accepted just animosity and acrimony towards Russian people here in this country because of the relationship of the superpowers is, a very nasty thing. You just kind of live with it. It's just, whatever anger there is towards Putin and, what's happened here in the United States over the last, 4 to 6 years, there are people here of Russian descent who have no relationship to those conflicts or those problems, and they have to go to work every day, ride the train every day, hearing this noise, just this anger, about this situation. So that Colossus was Russian, so a Russian young person making his way through school and through post-puberty and whatever was a very important thing. But also, you had Storm, who was, of African descent, was an African person living in America. They just sort of smashed so many things in that one burst of here are the new X-Men. And the fact that the two women on that team were the most powerful characters in terms of sheer brute power. It was Jean Grey and Aurora Monroe. One commands the elements and the other one commands energy on every type of spectrum. And that was you just kind of accepted it. It wasn't promoted as a feature of that comic, that these two women had this incredible agency and this incredibly powerful, they were kind of the big tank at the end of that engine whenever they went off and fought some sort of superpowered being. And you just that's just the way it was. So as far as, looking at them through the lens of diversity today, of course, which is a big concern to, multinational corporations and entertainment companies, because they don't want to alienate consumers, right? They have a real vested interest in sort of presenting their cosmologies as a real fair thing. X-Men sort of did it in a way that felt very organic. It felt very much like they were trying to sort of reflect the world of its time, or the time, the time in which this fictional world is being created, and that meant having people. You couldn't have a school that didn't have people of different nationalities, different ethnicities. It felt very real that way.
So I want to draw a point to one of the comments we got over there, just asking if any of the mutants carrying specific political themes in their personal stories. And I think that any marginalized group, and it sucks, this is something that has to be true by its very nature, existing is kind of this political statement. Existing as a queer person, existing as a person of color, has become this kind of political statement just by living. And like in the comments, Storm has become this icon for powerful Black women, and just their very nature, their background, their history, all of it is a social commentary. And in the same way, and I don't know if this could have been said in the beginning, but the lack of these marginalized groups is a political statement in and of itself. By being in the year of 2020 and having a team of superheroes in America all be cisgender, heterosexual, white people, that is a political statement in and of itself, because it is, and at this point it has to be, an intentional absence of this diversity. And it is just as much a political statement as having a team of no white cis men on a team. It's all everything with the reach the X-Men has is going to have a political effect from it.
Well, I think there was, as with a lot of the Marvel comics, and this is one of their great achievements, was they kind of understood, the editors and the writers of that generation, that you're sitting with this comic in your hands and you're sitting in a real world. As much as it transports you to this wonderful place where it entertains you, you are still sitting in a real place. You're a real person and you're holding this, and your reality informs the reality we all share, the common reality, informs the story you're reading. It was very important that their stories took place in New York and not some fake version of New York. So you had that feeling that if you were, riding to school and you were taking the C train, Daredevil might be on his way to work too, like right behind you. like you were in the very same place. So you're right, to do something selective, in a certain sense, you can say that movies, just dramas coming out of Hollywood, were science fiction up until the mid 60s or so, because they were racist by omission, and they were had people acting in unnatural ways. That was all part of this fantasy machine. But even in its most innocent, direct attempts to portray life back to its audience, it was showing them a fantasy. It was showing them this place where misery was invisible, the real sort of cost of prosperity, the real cost of the hierarchies that they're part of are invisible. It's happening off screen. At the most, you'll see someone of a lower class appear sort of happily doing their job, operating an elevator or, working labor, whatever. But, you know, racism by omission is still racism. Oppression by omission is still oppression. If you can control whether someone appears at all, that's real power. That's, in your hands. And these guys as creators, decided to make a bigger world, I think. And, we call it inclusivity today, all that stuff. One of the best answers I ever heard with regards to that question was Todd McFarlane was answering a question from a very small kid, like a 12-year-old at Boston Comic Con. And he said, he was answering the question that he occasionally gets, and from how exhausted he sounded like when he said it, he probably gets it asked a lot about why Spawn is black. And he said, sometimes there's a black guy and sometimes he's in my story. And the fact of the matter is, what people are calling diversity is really just reality. How small is the world that you're going to present to a reader going to be? And he asked this kid, because we were standing around a bunch of us, he's like, how would you tell the story of us having this conversation right now? There is an Asian person standing next to us. There's people of all ethnicities. You're just going to ignore the fact that these people existed during this conversation? It's not a good way to tell that story. And that was the best answer, I've ever heard to that sort of, whether it's Comicsgate, whether it's, all the other sort of weird passive aggressive responses to comics trying to frankly correct something that's been a blind spot for a long time. That was the most human and honest answer I've heard to that question. Something that X-Men's been doing the heavy lifting on for a long time, as far as I'm concerned.
So we got some questions in the comments and some really great comments about a lot of these topics, like like for example, how Miles Morales is presented as a political statement when he just is in a story. When he just appears, he suddenly is a political statement for some reason. And also like Chris Bagalume, which is doing a lot of great comments, said like, if we feel like fiction is a more powerful tool for raising awareness and educating people about the state of the world than, for example, the news.
Absolutely. I think absolutely. I think that is the role art plays in our society. It creates empathy. It creates that connection that someone may not feel when it's on the news. They can kind of box away real life events somehow easier than they can fictional ones, because a good writer, a good artist can create that connection. So like you were saying, is they may not care about a real person named Jean Grey, but now they care about this fictional character named Jean Grey. They care about the experiences Aurora went through. So Aurora experiencing racism is different than their neighbor or someone down the block, because they feel like they know that person, they are connected to that person, they may relate to that person. And now all of a sudden the same message is hitting differently.
Well, it's interesting, when we talk about these issues and when we talk about, again, particularly with social media, the kind of strange reactions that people have to the, inclusion of a character of a certain ethnicity, or the changing of a character's ethnicity. We deal with so many possibilities and fantasizing in science fiction and superhero fiction, in all speculative fiction, all fantasy fiction. it's interesting what people find impossible. It's like it's entirely impossible for someone to be bit by a radioactive spider and gain powers, which makes no goddamn sense. It has no foundational. Stanley and
Right.
Jack Kirby's own words, they said it was ridiculous, but it was just a great concept and idea. And
Mhm.
the idea of that person being African American is so startling to some people, or that person being LGBTQ is so It's like that's where you draw the line, like not the spider trans turning this guy into the fact that he's a teenager that built his own wrist web shooters
Mhm.
and became like a costume designer overnight.
Over.
Like, all of none of that's a stopping point for you. But this thing is, and that really exposes. I think that's part of the work that comic books do too. Even in this uncomfortable time where we're having these puerile conversations about who deserves to have a character based on them by
Mhm.
that it's pushing that conversation, and that's as long as, put it this way, I guess is the way I should say it, as long as Peter Parker remained a white kid from Queens, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So even the
Mhm.
bad reaction to it is important, because I think now kids on the schoolyard are having this conversation. And it's not a new one, man. I mean, I'm 52 years old. I remember when Crisis on Infinite Earths came out. And there's this great moment, just to talk about DC Comics for a second. There's a great moment where John Stewart shows up and this character says, "Hey, it's the Black Green Lantern." And he goes,
Yeah.
"No, just the Green Lantern. I'm a Green Lantern. I'm not the Green Lantern. I'm not a different Hal Jordan.
Mhm.
I'm the guy with the ring. I'm the guy who protects this sector now. It's a job, and I have it. And that's it." And it was such a beautiful moment that cut through, again, a lot of the sort of wonderful correctives that I grew up with have had to be reassessed, right? I mean, just a character like Black Lightning or Black Goliath, the fact
Mhm.
that his race had to be implicit in the title. That's what made Black Panther so radical. It doesn't refer to the man, it refers to the totemic animal that the man bears.
Mhm.
His being African is just part of who he is. But this, you know, artificial political skin color construct is not what's identifying him. It's like they got to have their cake and eat it too with that character.
Mhm.
And that stuff's so important. To the extent that these ugly conversations are happening, I think they need to happen, because otherwise they remain unspoken,
Mhm.
and that's more dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think, speaking to that question, I think it's absolutely what I agree with everything you just said. But I think that even in the casting of these characters, even if we're going to ignore everything, if you look at the casting of a Jean Grey, the casting of a Storm, the casting of a Cyclops, it's like, what does that person stand for in their real life? I forget. Um, um, God, Guardians of the Galaxy's director, with all the backlash he was getting, it was like, even if he's telling a good story, should he be allowed to continue telling his story? And stories are an innate part of just being human, passed down from being oral stories to being written to even like recipes, something you might not know how to read, but you saw your grandmother put these eggs, this flour, this, that. I think that the fiction of it all kind of makes it forces all of us to make this thing real. Um, Again, going back to the casting, whenever they do decide to bring mutants into the MCU, now you're looking at which mutants they're bringing in, what time they're bringing in. If we get this casting, is this does they have the right accent for this character? And even if so, um, it's do their upbringing or their genetic makeup, because this person is playing Kamala, like her friend. And forgive me because I'm going to get this wrong. I want to say one of the arguments was that one of her friends in the book, who is going to be played in the show or the movie rather, was like half white, and it was like, why are they Italian and this versus it? So even down to the casting, not even the stories we're telling, the casting even gets so important when it gets into these stories that we've um, imprinted on, for lack of a better term. So again, just agree with everything you've said, but I think even with the casting itself, that becomes a big deal. How does this person live their life? Does it line up with this character that I love and the things that they've done for the last 60 years in this book?
Well, it's interesting, because like if you look at the old Batman Adam West series in
Mm-hmm.
1966, there was a time when the Joker was Puerto Rican and
Yep.
Catwoman was an African
Yep.
American woman,
Eartha.
and nobody said shit. It was just
Mm-hmm.
a non-issue, and
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting. Again, I'm sorry, I'm like crossing universes here, but when DC did Batman 66, the print comic book, they
Mm-hmm.
did a really wonderful thing. The comic starts off and it's Eartha Kitt as Catwoman, and she gets out of jail, and then she's Julie Newmar, and they don't even explain it. They just go, "That's the way this show was, and that's the way this comic's going to be." Sometimes she's Eartha Kitt, sometimes she's Julie Newmar, and we don't care, and you shouldn't either. And it was just a wonderful way to again sort of underscore the complete irrelevancy of skin color based sort of race as a concept, and just go, these are the iconic actresses who played this role, and we're gonna portray them both, without, no one's gonna bat an eyelash.
Right.
So, but yeah, it's, listen, all of it's, comic book nerds have always been vocal. We're a vocal bunch. We were vocal when we didn't have a voice.
Right.
Like in the 1970s, you read those letter pages, and people are writing to Stan Lee and Jim Shooter, like he's the head of their local PTA. It's like, you don't have this relationship with this guy, dude. You're just a 10-year-old, but people didn't care. That's the way I wrote letters too. I was like, I want to take umbrage with you about issues, blah 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 blah, and that was it, and all that's changed is that we now have agency and have a direct hotline to these guys. And I think that corporations were initially excited about it because it was a way to just sell us more stuff. But now, as we've sort of enforced ourselves into including ourselves in the development process of everything, it's probably driving them a little crazy, but tough. If that's what it means to be a consumer today, that's what it means. And, we're comic book nerds are like anybody else. We're not going to ask for more or less power. We're going to ask for more, and we're going to want an involvement in this thing that, if we're buying your plastic, if you're buying your stories, if we're invested in your mythology and we're supporting to it, if we're subscribing to it, for lack of a better term, then yeah, we're going to want it to look like us. We're going to want it to look like the world. We're going to want it to be serious. We're going to want it to be good. We're going to want it to be consistent,
So in the comments also, Chris Vagalume, who is making a lot of great comments, uh, talk about the casting of Roberto da Costa in the New Mutants movie, which was whitewashing, and it's the reason we don't talk about this movie in this show. Like, that's the reason. And Cecilia Reyes.
I do want to jump in because for me, it goes beyond just the casting of Henry Zaga as Roberto da Costa, when being Afro-Brazilian was such rooted in his existence. It's literally the first or second page. He gets jumped on the soccer field for being black. But even beyond that, like you were saying, with the views of the people who are behind the scenes, the director of New Mutants actually in an interview said that he didn't care about the colorism that was inherent in Brazilian culture and how it wasn't something that he wanted to consider. And just those views, it makes an impact on the media. The lack of diversity is a political statement. He made that choice of not wanting to deal with casting someone who's a person of color, and I feel like that in of itself is a political statement.
Now,
at the very least, he's eliminating just a storyline. It's a weird kind of editing, and at that point, you have to question what the motivation is. And if the motivation is apathy or the motivation is an outright racial insensitivity, neither answer is acceptable.
Right. Or laziness, it's not okay.
Yeah, it's extremely. He also mentioned how he wanted someone who looked affluent, and this person, and that for me it was like, okay, so as long as he's lighter, that's which like okay. I took issue with it. I slogged through the movie just to make sure I saw it. And there was a lot of things that, even with Cecilia, I grew up with her being a brown woman with hair that I'm used to comics not getting black or brown hair right, either locks or braids. Who we got on screen, that's another symptom. I'm like, who is this? I can accept an alternate version, but when there are so few black and brown people to begin with in comparison to the white characters, it's like, well, this was a choice. This was a choice that you made, and now you've taken away. What about some Latinx girl who wants to be a doctor? Not that the aspirations for being a doctor rest solely on New Mutants, but like there's something there. And like you said, I think it's lazy, and I think it's a very powerful position that you're in when you're one in comics media and then in comics media live action, where a lot of the world at large looks at it as kiddish things. I mean, of course, the landscape have changed, but this is something that's targeted at kids, and then we, of course, being older and adults, consuming as well. But it's like, I may be rooted in who I am and I know what I want, but there could be two or three examples just from the pages alone that you could have put on screen. I don't know.
hmm
I-
I'm with you completely with the rage with Cecilia Reyes. Cecilia Reyes not only is just as an X-Men, but as a Marvel character, is one of the very, very, very few Puerto Rican characters,
Mhm.
and that is another thing of her identity that was kind of washed away by the casting of that actress.
Mhm.
And like you said, like whatever the reasoning behind it, whether it was some implicit racism, like all Latinx people are the same regardless of
Mhm.
skin tone or
Mhm.
origin, it's something worth talking about as to
Mhm.
what went into that casting. And I
Mhm.
think it's going to be the same thing with all movies going forward, and I think that that's an important thing to be had,
Yeah,
uh, particularly in regards to race.
absolutely. I agree. I agree.
Mm.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, okay. And another thing, Yana, Magic. I know kids are kids and kids are assholes, but the way in which they leaned into this like
The
racism
racism.
with her, I was what story are you telling there? And it's like, oh, this beautiful blonde, powerful girl, even she's gonna be racist, which I think could be a good story beat, but in that movie, I just think it fell flat. To me, it came out of nowhere.
hmm
What is this? But I just
and then only for it to be called out one time, and not even on it being racism, but on it being unoriginal was the only way it was called out in the movie.
yeah.
Um, why?
That, but
Missed opportunities, you know.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, honestly,
You know,
yeah.
and again, like lazy is being generous.
Mm,
I mean, because in some cases, as you're saying, it's not as though these choices aren't deliberated endlessly. I mean, for
mhm,
anyone who's listening to this who's been a part of any development process, it's it's
mhm.
I mean, so that if that's the choice they landed on, they need to be called out for it. So
Absolutely, brother. Thanks.
So I want to bring 2 points, but the first, before we get into, I think that was mentioned in the comments a couple of times, which was the animated series, and I guess it rose with a lot of things that you were saying of teaching these things to kids. But before we get to that, I want to get into a one thought that happened at Marvel that was Heroes for Hope starring the X-Men, that I look at it these days mostly because it's weird that a big corporation does a comic that is not for profit, which is the first thing that struck me about that comic. Is not for profit. And it was about famine in Africa, so it was like, it's kind of a mostly liberal them, but it still is a comic that is done only to donate, which is weird for these big comparisons. And it was an effort of Jim Suber, of Ann Nocenti, of Chris Claremont, of bringing the creative team of, the characters of the X-Men to do something for the world, to change the world. And I think that's a great concept. However, if the form is not like the best we can think of,
yeah,
but it's something that I feel like should stay more relevant to this day. Because, like, for example, I talk about Black Lives Matter at the beginning of this. How great would be a comic that was explicitly for the bail funds, for the donations
Mhm.
of that stuff? How great would be a comic that was not made for profit?
Mhm.
And I don't know what you all think about this idea. It's something that struck me. There's a lot of great creators of that in that comic too, that were not really working a lot for Marvel. And
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
Heroes for Hope came out when I was in high school, and again,
Mhm.
I'm 52, so that's
Mhm.
1985. It's
Okay.
important to note that Marvel was not then the company it is today.
Mhm.
It's a much smaller company. It was a company, I won't say so, but during those years they were in financial trouble. It was
Mhm.
very much a smaller company that certainly had its corporate infrastructure within, but the what was governing it was a very sort of human presence. I
Mhm.
would say not so much a faceless board, but a sort of college of editors. And I would say, what was really important about it, you know, it was kind of a moment where comic books, print comic books in particular, sort of asserted themselves as just as pop stars are doing Band Aid and things like that. Like we have a role in this as well.
Mhm.
So it was a very singular moment insofar as I think prior to that, comics. I mean, comics today still to a certain degree aren't taken terrifically seriously, but the fact that the editors and the writers of that time, I mean, I think Alan Moore did a section in it, and that's like
Mhm.
maybe his only Marvel credit. Like, um,
Mhm.
That was with Richard Corbin drawing. Alan
oh
Moore and
yes,
Richard
yeah.
Corbin.
Oh,
Mhm.
how appropriate, right? Because he just
And I forgot to
passed
say the
away.
them, but the theme of the one shot was the X-Men experiencing hunger,
Mhm.
which in itself is a pretty like motivating them that wasn't like told in the books at
Mhm.
all. They didn't experience hunger a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's. I think that's the thing that sort of, in my mind, set it apart. That it was this moment where they felt uh, that by their very reach, by their very, regardless of whether they were looked at as a legitimate part of the media cycle or a legitimate media channel, they insisted that they were. And they said, most of our readers are kids and adolescents and a
Mhm.
certain group of young adults. I think the print readership obviously has sort of aged, skewed a little older.
Mhm.
At the time, I think that they sort of recognized that they had a responsibility, insofar as Marvel in particular had always insisted that their comics, again, their unique selling propositions to a reader is that you're reading a comic book about the world that you're in. Like
Mhm.
Spider-Man lives in Queens.
Mhm.
Matt Murdock lives in Hell's Kitchen. The
Mhm.
Avengers Mansion is on Long Island. And et cetera, et cetera. And that carried over into the concerns that probably those editors and writers were parents and people themselves, and had their own lives to live, and clearly had that first and foremost on their mind.
Mhm.
I don't think we can discount those as motivations, as opposed to today where it probably comes from a corporate level concern where they say we have to address this issue in order to
Mhm.
look responsible in the
Right.
marketplace.
Right.
It's a lot on the look and more on the do
Mhm.
part, and that was what struck me as, oh, they did something here because they weren't making it for profit.
Right.
Mhm.
Like now, this kind of efforts are for profit.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
was very interesting at the time. I mean, it was extremely unique as an effort.
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
I think maybe this might be me being way too cynical, but I think that that kind of situation is not going to happen today. That with the size of Marvel and the ownership of Marvel being owned by another corporation, I think that everything is done from a business
Mhm.
perspective. And I think that expecting them to make these decisions that is not from a business perspective is a little bit too idealistic to hold true.
Mhm.
But I do think that, like you said, it's about what it looks like. I think that we as the consumers can make it so that way them making these decisions
Mhm.
good for them from a business perspective,
Mhm.
showing that we, with our dollar, will vote for companies that do
Mhm.
movements like this,
Right.
as opposed to the actual content and the stories, which are done more by individuals and can come from a more human perspective, which is how we can see these things on panel, but the actual actions of the business may not always reflect that.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys know the film The Player by Robert Altman, but there's a
Mm-mm.
great opening in it with Tim Robbins. He plays a studio executive, and this writer has presented him the script that's political. And the writer says, "Oh, so political scares you? The political is frightening to your studio." And he says, "Political doesn't scare me. Radical political scares me. Black
Mm.
scares me. Feminist political scares me.
Mm.
But political doesn't scare me."
Mm. Well,
You just listed everything that is political in life,
And
and I
not
think that,
conservative.
right.
yeah, it's kind of the big underneath. They're only going, as I think you're saying, Gabriel, like they're only going to go as far as they need to assure us as consumers that
Mm-hmm.
they're on the right side of things. But
Right.
with regards to an actual bottom line on an effort, that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, man. Yeah, agreement as well. I know when I was young, my me and my cousins would get into it about like Power Rangers and stuff. And one thing that kind of I feel holds true, and it might be just re-saying what exactly what you just said, but even if the motivations aren't pure, if at the end of the day we get more of these stories, more of these creative things put together that look more like the characters in the books, you're still going to end up hopefully with a good story. And I guess now with technology and social media being as big as it is, it's really about applying that pressure. Because there are a few announcements from the Disney Investor Day where I was kind of looking sideways at it, like this is clearly due to a lot of vocal nerds and general public that have spoken to, like even outside the Tiana movie. For me, it was like the Princess and the Frog story has been around forever and a day. That movie came out so long ago. Why is it now being course corrected? And I can't even remember the date. I think it was 2022. But it's like now you're putting in this effort. I may be jaded. I'm sure there's little kids who are going to enjoy it, but it's like ah, you're doing this because of everything you've seen. You're doing this because of all the conversation and pressure that's been put on you. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm like, hey,
I
But
mean, and I'm willing to concede that there's always more to it. I mean, let's
mm,
face it, the leadership at these companies has changed in a generation.
yeah,
There was a time when I never saw a young person, in the studio structure or
hmm,
a person of color, and that's different, and that matters. When the writers are diverse, when the
hmm,
leadership is diverse, when the development structure is diverse, when the editors are diverse, you're
yeah,
gonna first of all clear away a lot of nonsense that they're
hmm,
just not gonna let happen on their watch.
hmm,
But you're going to have that at least as a preoccupation
hmm,
that's going to mitigate certain things, and that's important. The inclusivity can't just be in the content without it happening
hmm,
within
I
the
agree.
machine that creates the content, right?
yes.
Hmm,
We're not, because frankly, let's face it, where are our news stories going to come from?
Hmm.
That someone's got to create new and better stuff, not just sort of correcting what exists.
right, right.
News
Yep.
stories that come, I mean, for whatever preoccupation people had with the angle of ethnicity in that Into the Spider-Verse movie,
Hmm,
fact remains, it's an incredible landmark piece of animation,
hmm, hmm,
and that it has those other things going on is great. But I'm very proud and happy of the fact that it's just good. You know,
hmm,
Yeah.
hmm,
things should always be good too. So.
Hmm.
right.
I absolutely agree. I think that having representation on the page or on the screen is important, but we also need representation behind the scenes. But kind of going back to what, nope, this way you were saying, with the motive, um, I'm I tend to be a little bit less concerned about the motive. I kind of jumping publishers. DC, I've read maybe two DC books in the past decade and a half,
Hmm,
but with everything reported for Future State, I think it's called, with there
Mm-hmm.
being a non-binary Flash, they're heroes of color. Like there have been people saying that maybe it's pandering, particularly with it being this limited time frame.
Yeah.
But pandering or not, they're doing it, and they're gonna get my money for doing it because if they're pandering, they're kind of pandering directly to me, and I want to reward that. So like as long as they're doing it and we reward it, then we could get more of it. And even though the motive may be this business money bottom line thing, as long as they're doing it and they're doing it like you said with Into the Spider Verse with quality,
Mm.
then I think that's important because then it's more likely to stick around.
Yeah, and I think, look, it's transactional, right? I mean,
Right.
we pay for this stuff.
Mhm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
to a certain degree, yeah, there's I'm not buying comics from them because they're saints. I'm buying comics from them because they're doing something good,
Yeah.
and it's better if it's reflective of reality to me.
Mm-hmm.
Better product. I don't want to read a story about the same people who look the same, doing the same things for the last 75 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's
It's
not
been
a good,
told before.
that's not a good product. Exactly. Well, it's not a new product, so why should I buy the why
Mm-hmm.
should I buy the new one if it's the same thing?
Right.
But I'll stick to my reprints then. I'll stick
Mm-hmm.
to my nice hardcover edition of, Captain America stories from the early 70s and not
Right.
buy the new ones. Something better happened. Something better changed. Something better reflect the world as it's changing and churning, and maybe frankly as it's always been.
Mm-hmm.
Bring a little more of that grit that Marvel has always prided itself on introducing into comic book stories in the form of a bigger lens. Again, as Todd McFarlane said, like, how small are you going to make the world in your comic book
Mm-hmm.
to protect this thing that makes you comfortable, whatever feeling that is.
Mm-hmm.
You're literally making it a smaller world. It's not reflecting the world as big and as rich as it is if you
Mm-hmm.
So now I wanna shift to the animated series because of some of the things you were talking about, of the people that work behind and create the product. The animated series had for I think all of its run black director and producer at its
Mm-hmm.
main lane, which is Larry Houston. And you know, I feel like the fact that it was not like just the same people with the same ideas, the same like white academics making the product made that product especially great. I love it especially, and especially like trying to bring the message since it's for kids. And I want to ask you all what you think about the social commentary on the animated series, which sometimes for me feels a little bit, but a lot of times it feels like it gets the part of the stories that is more like for teaching how these stories matter in the world. That I feel like it does that a lot for me with Magneto, with the M asteroid, with Genosa too, and with a lot of other stuff. So I just ask.
I mean, that animation was a real landmark insofar as how closely it followed the comic.
Yeah.
There had been such horrendous missteps, in the 70s with animated adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird because they start in a place that's very sort of a one-to-one adaptation in the 60s with, however flawed it is, the Fantastic Four cartoon of that time,
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of Marvel Man series where they literally just did animatics taken from Jack Kirby and Don Heck drawings,
Mm-hmm.
just animated them.
Mm-hmm.
Get closer than that.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as this being a production, it's, I mean, they followed things very, very closely. With standards and practices, I mean, they necessarily softened things because X-Men as a superhero book was as close to being something for mature readers as you could get, just because of the nature of the violence and the social issues they were dealing with. To bring that to Saturday morning television, I think was a real challenge. I think, here it was distributed through the Fox affiliate in the United States. So, they had to deal with all that, I think they did an admirable job of adapting that stuff for animation. just because of what time period it existed in.
Right.
Today, it would seem like a pretty soft approach, but as we were saying before, just the actual existence of certain things that they just didn't change them, brought them one to one, in itself was a very, very uh, politically meaningful thing. I thought
Yeah.
there was nothing else like it at the time when it was on Saturday morning television. That's for sure.
Mhm.
I think that the animated series, it was something I grew up with, and I think it very much leaned into the metaphor, the mutant metaphor, all of it, fighting for those that fear and hate us, and it leaned into that and brought it to a new generation of kids. Um, and I kind of disagree a little bit in what you're saying about in the time, because particularly when it's matched up with the other X-Men cartoons, with X-Men Evolution and Wolverine of the X-Men,
Mhm.
it really held truer to that metaphor than either of the other two did. And it really brought forward, the explicit racism experienced even in the first few episodes
Mhm.
with Jubilee, and then with the Legacy virus and the Genosa storyline, and it really hit those points. And to me at least, it hit heavy, um, far heavier than most Saturday morning cartoons would then. And I do think still pretty heavy compared to what Saturday morning cartoons, I think Saturday morning cartoons is still a thing, would hit now. Um, at least from what I know of.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with you. When I said in its time, I meant comparative to other things that were on
Okay.
Saturday morning television in that time. If you flick the dial, and remember also, like, Fox was a new affiliate back then. Like,
Yeah.
my generation grew up with three networks. For
Mhm.
like, there was this Upstart, which also gave us Batman the animated series just
Right.
like 4 or 5 years later. But the X-Men, by their very nature, because it's a group of various ethnicities, just porting that project into a Saturday morning context, there just wasn't anything even in competition with it. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think what you're talking about in terms of the later iterations being softer on the metaphor has to do with how the whole landscape changed, right? Like in the 80s, again, these were still, they weren't cottage industries because DC was owned by Warner Brothers, but Warner Brothers, or Warner Communications at the time, still had a hands-off approach on it. They sort of treated DC Comics like an R&D department. Like, we don't understand your business, so you keep doing stuff in print, and we'll occasionally basically license it and use it. And Marvel was, had been owned by Cadence Industries for a while. They had to go public in the early 90s, this, quasi disastrous IPO that was
Mhm.
launched. It wasn't until sort of Avi Arad comes on board with, Saturday morning television really as part of that engine that it really starts to explode and become the sort of company we recognize today. I mean, it's interesting. It's like we always think of this Marvel DC dichotomy, but in terms of actual circulation, DC was a much, much bigger company than Marvel for a very long time.
Yeah. True.
Marvel was very much, uh, certainly in the words of people who worked there during that time period, felt very much like they were upstarts,
Mm.
kind of chip on their shoulder about things. So for them to be, even on, what was then called the fourth network, was a huge deal for them to have a syndicated product. Um,
Mhm.
and again, that they brought it so directly. I think there was a bit of, compared to those later X-Men Evolution, I don't want to say there wasn't as much thought, but there probably wasn't as much anxiety about.
Mm.
They just didn't know better. They didn't know that they could get into trouble. That there was
Mhm.
going to be some sort of backlash from whoever. Certain sort of parent groups. Wondering why there was suddenly
Mhm.
this, multi-ethnic super team discussing race. Episode to episode every Saturday,
Mhm.
and the ratings were through the roof. It did extraordinarily well.
Yeah. I'll even mention being a kid, reading the books and then watching the series and growing up with the series. It's like even the voice acting for me, being a black kid with family members who came from kind of all over, some in New York, so I get a bit of an accent, some from the South, so I get that. But like hearing Rogue for the first time, hearing Storm, hearing Colossus, that to me was a big deal as well. So just kind of throw that in there, not even just the representation, just like visually, but audibly, like this is a very like when I read Rogue to this day, you know who I'm hearing, like no matter what. I don't. So yeah, I think even that's something to consider is that um, dealing with not just the visual aspect, but audio. What does it sound like? And he even hearing words that you ordinarily wouldn't. Like even in the way in which Gambit speaks, like I can read this on page, but if I'm 7, I'm reading. But when I hear him, share this, that. Like when I'm hearing that, it becomes a whole new experience. So yeah, I think again agreeing with everything, but throwing that little bit in there, that was a big deal for me. Characters I love who don't sound like me, and now I see why. Never talked to a Russian before, but this is my idea of what a Russian person sounds like now. So, there's that.
Hey, before that, it was Chekhov on Star Trek, right?
Yeah, right.
That was everybody's idea of how a Russian person sounded.
Yeah. Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Um, they were also very important for me. Like I started reading the X-Men comics because of the cartoon. I watched the cartoon and I was like, oh my God, I love this. I need to see where it comes. And as all of you have said, like it holds very close to the original material, which is great.
Mhm.
And also like there's bits of it because I have also been rereading some stuff for today about the legacy virus. I don't know what to comment on that because I'm not sure where it stands really. It's really complex, but I think I like more what happens in the Emergence series just because it's more simpler. It's in two places. Well, it's not in two places, but the second place for me is also that. It's in Time Fugitives, I think, where they infect humans and they blame mutants. And that really, really felt closer to like the um, social anxieties around AIDS, which was part of what I think was they were trying to do with the legacy virus in the comics sometimes. And for me, in the other story that I think we're gonna talk about that one in a so soon, which is the Have Yourself a More Luck Little Christmas, which doesn't have the legacy virus, but has a character that has an illness that is not talked about, and that also reflects on illness that only affects marginalized people, and that happens within that story. And well, I this is a heavy topic, I'm sure, but like I kind of sometimes feel like that's a thing that was very not crossed onto comics, and even if the X-Men comics didn't like face it directly and didn't make something direct, at least they kind of wanted to talk about it sometimes. And I wish I have seen more stories by gay authors about the legacy virus, or at least treating how it's inconsistent with that. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, the legacy virus is an interesting one because it's created, right? I mean, I think it was the character was unleashed.
Strife, one of the two.
Reverend Strife. It's. I mean, it's interesting insofar as again, it's another potent allegory insofar as it's about the politicization of a disease, right?
Yeah.
Normally, when a disease is demonstrably hitting everybody, it's just about solving it. But when it's localized in a group, then that becomes sort of here in the United States. I mean, the White House didn't mention the word AIDS until after 1990. It was insanity. It was like, I mean, could you, hey, the current administration tried to not talk about it, I guess. So it's, but it's something that, was made all the more easier because it was a, group, an identifiable group that was the target of a lot of oppression and prejudice. So it was used as an excuse to not respond, basically.
Right.
And I think a lot of that's in that story. The legacy virus is fascinating because it's, how it plays out is just really interesting. And, it's in the future, and it's, selectively
Growth.
drunk, and it sort of plays to today. It would play to all sorts of people's conspiracy theories, right?
Right.
Yeah.
About
Right. Right.
how the government created it and all this stuff. And the bottom line, I think that I walked away from reading a lot of those stories in that arc was that it kind of doesn't matter. What matters is the response.
Mm.
It doesn't matter who started it. It doesn't matter who's suffering from it. What really matters is if you're part of a society that can say to itself, this isn't important enough to deal with. And that's an indictment on your society then.
Mm.
And it just, again, it underscores it was a new way to look at that mutant oppression trope,
Mm.
you know, in a guise that wasn't just about ethnicity as a metaphor, that it was about something else, that I think, played to the AIDS crisis very directly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When it comes to Legacy Fires, I'm also kind of, like you were saying, Dune, I'm a little bit conflicted with it. I think the show did handle it much better for all those reasons you were mentioning. As I think that the longer it was around in the comic books, the more convoluted it got the more sci-fi it got, and I feel like it kind of lost some of the metaphor with where it came from and how it came from and the role in the plots. And I think that it got pushed away from being this kind of allegory towards the AIDS crisis into this sci-fi plot point, and I
Mm.
think that kind of lessened the impact that it could have had.
Yeah.
But I also that's also could very well just be a kind of hindsight 2020 thing,
Mhm.
where they were trying to keep it relevant and it kind of got out of hand a little.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just spiraled out of control. I think your impression is correct. It's just,
It went from one writer's hands to another, to another, to another, and they all add their thing into it.
Yeah.
And, and that's why I think it would have been interesting to have it written by someone who has that experience, because they maybe could have brought that into the basic meaning,
Mm-hmm.
which is what they did in the animated series. They did just 2 episodes, and in these
Yep.
2 episodes, it was clear this was blame on all mutants. If it affected one human, it was the responsibility of all mutants, and that's what it
Mhm.
brought to the book.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, yeah. Again, ditto, cosign, all of that. I I think that's where a lot of maybe indie comics or new creators can come in and do. I don't want to say better things, but like you said, having it become this whole thing that it wasn't initially. I think that's good and bad because you want stories to evolve, but at the same time, if it's supposed to be an allegory for the AIDS crisis, let's then see how does this affect these people, and these people. Even like something with like sickle cell. How is this affecting these mutants, these black mutants? And then so again, agreeing with everything that was said, I wanted more of it. I wanted more because it was something that was so fascinating to me as a kid, not knowing anything past maybe a couple family members having diabetes. Like I didn't know much about disease past what we got in school. So that's something that I think was handled well, like you said, with the 2 episodes. But I would have liked to have seen more. Looking back, anyways, as a kid, I was just happy to watch the show. But I would have liked to have seen more, and maybe it handled by people who may be dealing with disease.
I mean, one of the things to your point, that thinking about it now as we're talking about it, one of the things that it made me think about, which I thought was very valuable,
Mm-hmm.
was the sort of the way disease becomes emblematic, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
right now here in New York, we're dealing with ridiculous coronavirus numbers again. And one of the things that always pops up is, you know, well, yes, there's a racial disparity, like Hispanics and African Americans are being killed by the
Mm-hmm.
disease. And it's like actually what they're being killed by is economics
Yep.
and their role in society. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's like they immediately frame it, based on someone's ethnicity. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like that's ridiculous. If these people weren't poor and didn't work all the high contact jobs,
Right.
weren't the orderlies, weren't the nurses, weren't the bus
Mm-hmm.
drivers in our
Mm-hmm.
society, of course, they're gonna die of sheer viral load, which is what's
Right.
happening. They just get re-exposed so many times.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, healthcare is not equitably distributed in this
Mm-hmm.
country. with regards to some sort of notion of color blindness.
Mhm.
And that series that touched on that in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
It's like this idea of a mutant disease, however real or imagined,
Right.
is what sort of focuses the response to it or the feelings
Mhm.
about it within
Mhm.
the world.
Right.
Different writers handled it different ways. It would be interesting to see someone do sort of like an omnibus of that with some sort of annotations
Yeah.
to point those things out. Not
I
that I
agree.
want that job. That sounds like trying to alphabetize a bowl of spaghetti.
Yeah.
There might be something there. I don't know because I don't. It's not one of the ones I couldn't. To your point, Gabriel, I couldn't stay on top of it. Like I missed issues here and there. Like thank God now for some of these digital services, they're not my preferred way to read things. But when I need to get an understanding of something, it's nice to be able to just go, okay, I'm just going to read this second Secret Wars and
Mhm.
every associated spin-off issue with it. And those digital services allow you to organize things like that. DC Universe, which is unfortunately
Right.
going to be turned into something like this, DC Infinite, has done a
Mhm.
wonderful job of doing that. Like they'll
Mhm.
just take like uh, death metal, and just here's all the associated weirdo comics in
Mhm.
order chronologically that you should be reading.
Mhm.
You probably didn't buy like
Right.
4 titles across the board in April to follow the story, but you
Mhm.
need to have a sort of full understanding about that.
Right.
So
Right.
Legacy is one of those ones that really deserves a real exegesis, I think.
I
More we
think
talk
so.
about
I think so. I think so.
it. Again, not the job I want. If you hire me for something else, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
So while we get close to the end, I want to ask you it's a question that someone left in the comments, so I'm just taking advantage to that. Chris Bagalume, again, thank you for all your comments. Said that if all of us have any particular X-Men or their stories that resonate with us, I want to expand that a little and talk about that resonate in a social commentary, political way, because that's the soul. But and also just take advantage of this to ask you, Sandy, about if any of the stories have an special influence in your work, because you write and draw and direct and do a lot of
I
things,
mean,
and also both of you, because I guess you all do creative things too.
I'll keep it short, and it's probably the answer a lot of people have. But the Jean Grey storyline. I was a child. I mean, I started reading it when I was 7 or 8, and it culminated like in '82 when I was already on my way to high school.
Mhm.
That run, that subplot of Jean Grey, slowly sort of increasing in power and trying to contend with this problem, which was basically her eroding psyche underneath all these stories. I mean, that team of Claremont and Byrne during those years, which culminates in Days of Future Past, that run, for me, Jean Grey died and stayed dead. I didn't acknowledge.
Mhm.
It's ironic because her character's name is Phoenix. If there was any character that was going to come back from the dead, it's going to rise from the ashes, it was going to be her, right? It's kind of like in the brand.
Mhm.
But the fact that she died by her own hand, that was incredibly, and the sense of finality of it.
Mhm.
At the time we really thought, this is like, wow, this really happened, and this is irreversible. This is it. And
Yeah.
the very next issue, I think Cyclops leaves the team. It was a real, to our mind as readers at the time, it was felt like such a courageous storyline for them to
Mhm.
devote so much time to developing it across years. But also, what it culminated in was so heavy. The stakes in the story were so heavy, and the morality at play in it was devastating. The fact that I mean, she commits planetary genocide. Like,
Mhm.
how? What do you move? Like, summary execution isn't even enough at that point. So, what resolution is there for this story?
Mhm.
There kind of isn't one.
Right.
She sort of chooses to end the story for us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's bizarre in a lot of ways because it's attacking things that the X-Men mythology isn't, or I don't think any superhero mythology is equipped to handle,
Mm-hmm.
and they sort of did it anyway.
Right.
And it was just, I mean, fantastic. From it coincides at a time where there was an explosion in draftsmanship and writing in superhero comics as well. You got to remember, like late '70s, early '80s. It's everybody from Miller to Sienkiewicz to Sienkiewicz, excuse me, to Mazzucchelli. It was just all over the place. And in the middle of it is this very coherent thing that very much felt like it had a beginning, middle, and end. And the stuff that came afterwards was absolutely interesting and amazing. But it stands out in my mind very much. Days of Future Past, those two issues inspired so much. They launched like another 20 years of storylines
Mm-hmm.
out of those two issues. Just this like Twilight Zoney.
Yeah.
Chris Claremont just deciding, hey, let me do my own what if within
Yeah.
X and have it be part of continuity. It was insane. It was an absolute insane thing. From the impact of that cover, where they're showing you, like Reed Richards deceased, like you're trying to see into that wanted poster
Mm-hmm.
behind Wolverine, with the spotlight on him, and
Right.
and you're trying to process, like, oh my God, how did they do this? How did they, so much of it is you're imagining the backstory of it. So for me, that's, I'll shut up now. That's the one
Mm-hmm.
that sort of still echoes. I mean, listen, it's all great stuff. It really is, but that's the one that's kind of a standard bearer for me that still echoes very loudly.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Man. For me, I think God Loves Man Kills.
Oh yeah.
Um, Being a queer kid in the '90s and hearing like everything about this part of the way you identify as bad, even tying in the legacy of it all with like all this AIDS thing going on. This is it was a very interesting time, and sort of read through that, especially with the religious aspects of it. It really, even as an adult reading, it's like I can conjure up easily some of those emotions from sitting in church and all of a sudden feeling like the conversation went left. And it's like, brimstone and inferno is coming for you specifically in this group of people. So out of all the X-Men media I've consumed, that has to be the one that kind of sticks with me, where it's like, oh man, this is the the way in which it's not us fighting robots and fighting superpowered people, but we're fighting this system that's set up that's attacking us in a way that our powers don't. They hurt us more than they help us. Me being able to walk through walls and read minds and fly, that is the very thing that's making me an easy target for this person that's influencing so many other people. And though they might be distorting the story, that's becoming the truth of so many other people who now are adding that fuel to the fire that's like, oh, down with the. So that has been yikes. Like that, I have like imprinted on that story, and it's like, man, that's the one for me. That's, yeah, God.
That's an excellent choice. That might be my strong number two.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, it's
great choice.
yeah. Yeah, reading it now still, I'm just like, man, we've come a long way, but we have not come a long way. Because you could repackage God Loves Man Kills right now. Like, you can put a brand new number one on it, maybe switch out a few of the X-Men and switch out the names. Like, you can do that, and it's still, I feel like it's going to be just as relevant. In most regards. So yeah, the religious aspect of it, and the political damning of like these people by very nature of existing, they are the threat. And then even the pointing out of Nightcrawler, like this demon, look at, like, just forget the human passing people, like folks like Nightcrawler who look the way he does. Like that, I liken it more because of personal experience to more flamboyant gay men and maybe more masculine looking gay women, and just the things that certain groups have on them. That's like, oh, I know that you must be from the suburbs, or you must be because of the way you wear your hair, and then you must be this type of person because of the way you wear your pants. To me, it was like everything scaled down into that one panel. Like, look at this monster, this demon. So yeah, I gotta go with God Loves Man Kills. Man, jeez.
When it comes to what resonates most with me, it's if you've listened to me on the show ever, it's a very obvious answer, and that is Richter. Um, Particularly in X Factor 45, uh, him coming out on panel when he kisses Shatterstar at the end of that issue, it resonated in me in a way that I didn't really realize what was missing in the X-Men comics until that moment.
Mm,
As a queer Latinx person, Richter, that scene, I didn't realize until that exact moment that there was no one who looked and loved like me in the X-Men. In
mm,
their, by that point, I think 50 years of existence, that was something that was missing. And me, I think I was like 21 at that time. Um, I didn't even recognize that I should be seen in
mm,
the media I consume until that moment.
mm,
And it changed the way I looked at the X-Men. It changed the way I look at media in general, in a
mm,
way that, you know what, I deserve to see myself in what I consume.
mm,
Um, and even the way they took, even before and after, the way they continue to show that character, you know, Richter is a character that struggles with mental health. In the first issue of X Factor, he is suicidal. He
mm,
notices that there is something missing in his life. He is depressed by it, and he tries to kill himself.
mm,
As someone who struggles with depression, that is something that I relate to, and that character and the choices he continues to make um, is something I relate to this very day. So Richter has and continues to be someone that I see myself in, and I'm glad that I'm able to do that. And I think that it's something that everyone should be able to do in a franchise that is so huge, both in time and the sheer number of characters present in the X-Men. There's no real excuse for there not to be someone who can't see themselves in the X-Men.
mhm. Agreed. Agreed.
Well said, too.
Yeah, I agree. Mm,
All of those answers were so great. And I think for me, it's difficult for me to pinpoint to one single story, but what I think resonates more is I don't want to say like the entirety of New Mutants, but more like a couple of moments and how they develop, especially around the events, the Mutant Massacre, the Fall of the Mutant events, Inferno. Inferno is more for personal reasons that really
mm,
socio-political, but they are mixed. They are mixed bag. So, and for me, what really strikes me is how those books dealt with
mm,
social trauma and with
mm,
kids having that trauma. Um, it's that issue. I think it's the 37 in which they are in a gravestone
mm,
in the cover of New Mutants, and the whole issue is just them dealing with the fact that they think most of their loved
mm,
ones are dead, and just going through that repetition process of like the grief, and it's just a dream or something like that. But like the thing that most resonates with me about that is that they decided that they could talk about all these different people that have very different types of trauma related to very different experience, and how they try to work with each other to make something that was worth living into, worth. And that's what really strikes me. That's the big part for me of like getting to New Mutants comics and reading these kids trying to organize within themselves to make their lives better
mm.
in the middle of the constant
Right.
things that happen in the world, which
Mm,
for me feels really poignant.
mm,
And that's it for me.
mhm. Yeah, I agree. Oh, those therapy sessions as kids. Yeah, yeah. Oof.
So I don't know if to close it here because
Mhm.
all of the things that we said at the end were I feel beautiful, and someone is validating me in the comments. Chris Bagabuma is validating me in the comments. I really want to be his friend.
Mhm.
So okay, so thank you all for coming today. Thank you Rain, for like just appearing here. That was like a really nice surprise, and it really drove the conversation more even. And thank you, Sandy, so much for coming today and for talking all these things with us from your perspective. Because it's like, I don't know, if I could have people that I admire creatively talking about X-Men, weirdly, that would be fine.
Well, it was wonderful being here. I enjoyed talking with you guys so much about this stuff.
Same.
Rare, it's rare that you get to sort of do a deep conversation on this stuff over as much a period of time. X-Men is as unifying as it is divisive, right? Because people break
Right.
up into camps and like they have their favorite writers and their favorite artists, and it's rare to find a group of people who appreciate them across the long view the way I do. So, so it was an absolute pleasure. I'll come back anytime. So
So remember to follow Sandy Jimenez and Sandy Jimenez on Twitter. It's very easy. And Carefree Black Nerd and Carefree Blair on Twitter. You're gonna be rewarded with tons of cool stuff, very much like what we have talked about here today. So, and we are at What's the Mutants on Twitter and Facebook. And till the next time,